Good morning and welcome to another edition of Missions Monday. We're in studio with Pastor Duane George, and on Zoom we have Pastor Zwane and Pastor Gary Groenewold. Our theme this Monday is spiritual fathers and spiritual sons. This is a topic that was extremely popular in the early 80s in Christianity, and then there's some controversy and some misunderstandings about this important doctrine. It kind of phased away. Now many people don't believe they need a spiritual father or that they could even have a spiritual son. And what exactly does that mean? We'll be talking about that today, this morning on Missions Monday. We'll begin with the devotion of Pastor Duane.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And we're going to be looking at 2 Kings chapter 2 in the aspect of Elijah and Elisha, and going through this. And it's interesting because in this aspect we have Elijah, who is nearing the end of his ministry, and Elisha, his protege, who's coming up, who's been discipled by him. And it says here in verse 1 that they went from Elijah and Elisha went from Gilgal, and then they went from Gilgal. Verse 2, then they said, Elisha says to the younger Elisha, "Stay here, just stay here in Gilgal." And he says, "I need to go to Bethel." And Elisha says, "You know what, as God's alive, my soul's with your soul. I'm not leaving you. I'm going to go to Bethel with you." And so they travel to Bethel. They find themselves in Bethel. And then all of a sudden, they find themselves in verse 4, where Elisha says, "You know, I'm leaving Bethel and I'm going to Jericho. Stay here." And Elisha thinks about it for a minute. He goes, no, I'm not staying here. If you're going, I'm going to Jericho with you. And they go to Jericho. And then they find themselves in the same sort of situation, verse 6, verse 7, where he says, "You know what? You stay here. I'm going to go to Jordan." And Elisha thinks about it again, and he says, "You know what? I've come this far. I'm going the whole way to Jordan with you. You're not leaving me behind." And he goes to Jordan with him. And at Jordan, we see that there is a thing that takes place all of a sudden. Elijah, and by the way, let me just say this. Each one of these places means something. You have Gilgal means death. It's the place of death. From Joshua chapter 5, it talks about it's a place of death. Everything comes to a stop there. And then Bethel. Bethel refers to our human spirit. It's a place where we become born again. Like, we are dead at Gilgal. We're spiritually dead. We have nothing. And this is where they are, and they travel to Bethel. The human spirit's revived by the Holy Spirit. We become born again. And then they move on to Jericho, and Jericho represents the human soul. The human soul is a place where we become dead to our natural man, our emotions, our feelings, what we want, our will. We die to that. And then the next place, and finally the Jordan River, the place where, if you remember, Naaman is told to go and be baptized, to be cleansed of leprosy. It's a place of human body. The human body comes to an end. And so Elijah at the Jordan River takes his mantle, and he strikes the Jordan River with the mantle, and the Jordan River splits. And they walk on to the other side. This whole time, there is what we would call the sons of the prophets from verse 3. We see them again mentioned, I believe it's in verse 5, verse 7, verse 15. The sons of the prophets here, and these are disciples. And they're sort of mocking Elisha. Every time Elijah goes somewhere, they're mocking him and says, "Hey, he's going to leave soon. He's going to leave you alone." But they're not following themselves. Only Elisha is following Elijah. They're all in, if we can say, Bible college together. But there's only one who's actually following in the footsteps of Elijah. And once they get to the other side of the Jordan River, they are there, and Elijah looks at Elisha and says, "I'm not going to be with you much longer. I've reached the Jordan River. I know I'm coming to the end. Is there anything I can do for you? What do you want from me?" And we see in verse 9 where Elisha says, "Before you go from me, I want a double portion of your spirit to be on me." And, okay, and all of a sudden they hear angels and they see chariots, and in a whirlwind Elijah is taken up. And in verse 12, Elisha sees it and he cries out, my father, my father. And I think this is key right here for our subject that we're talking about. My father, my father. The chariot of Israel, its horsemen, they've come. And as Elisha is taken up, the same mantle that he used, and the word mantle, it's actually made up of two Hebrew words. It means large, glorious, worthy, but then it also means a garment, cloth, dress, or a robe. So it's a large, glorious garment, robe. This is what he used to strike the water, and it falls to the ground. And Elisha picks up the mantle, and he puts it on. And he uses the same mantle to strike the water again, and the river parts, and he crosses back over to the original side. The last miracle that Elijah did is the first miracle that Elisha did, parting the Jordan River. And I just want to, there's a couple aspects here. Let's break down what a spiritual father is. I break it down into this way. There's all of us have a natural or an earthly father, whether we know him or not, whether he was our spiritual leader or not. All of us have a natural father, whether we knew him or not. Then there is the real, what we would call spiritual father. There's a spiritual father that has begotten us into the faith. There's a spiritual father that has led us to Jesus Christ. And Pastor Kavicki in Youngstown, Ohio, is my spiritual father. And then the third aspect of a spiritual father is what I would call is more of an adopted father, a spiritual adoption. This is a father that has taken a son to be his own and has poured his life into him, has discipled him. He may not have led him to the Lord, but he is discipling him and ministering to him. He is his own son. And this is where we see Paul and Timothy, okay? The same type of thing. I see this. Pastor Shibeli is my adopted spiritual father. He took me as his own and discipled me for 30 years now, okay? But Pastor Kavicki is my spiritual father that led me in the faith. And there comes a time, and I'll wrap up the devotion with this. There's two aspects here. There comes a time in all of our lives where we have to make a decision. Are we going to follow our spiritual father? How far am I going to go? How much death am I willing to experience in my natural life? Then there's the second aspect. There comes a time when I have to leave my spiritual father and walk on my own. My spiritual father can only take me so far. Doesn't mean I leave him, but it means I have to walk on my own. And this is where Elisha was. Elisha had to smite the river, watch it part, and cross back over here. He didn't build a tabernacle on the far side of the Jordan River and say, I'm never leaving this place because this is the last place where Elijah was. He parted the water, went back over to the other side, and joined the other sons of the prophets and the other men of God, and went over and started his own ministry. And I think that's where spiritual sonship and spiritual father is very key. That a spiritual son needs to come to a place in his life where he says, you know what? It's time for me to cross the Jordan River, go back over to the other side, start my own ministry, and be led by God. And I think as a spiritual father, that becomes a joy to see a son mature enough to walk away, to go on his own and start his own ministry, to go through his bumps and bruises and growing pains on his own without having a dependence upon me as a spiritual father. And I think that's a great joy to see. And some of us may never have a spiritual son in the aspect we don't lead someone to Christ, or we may not have a spiritual son where we disciple that person. But we sure look for the opportunity and take advantage of it when we have it.
Let's piggyback that thought. That this topic we're speaking about today is not a necessity, but it is definitely an opportunity. Paul mentions in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 2, he mentions Timothy as his spiritual son. He mentions in Titus chapter 1, verse 4, Titus as his spiritual son. What's interesting is that he has a lot of guys that are following him, but he only calls these two his spiritual sons. So it seems as if to say all of these men may have been discipled by Paul, but he didn't consider them spiritual sons. And then also too, Paul also mentions spiritual fathers. 1 Corinthians 14:15, he says, 4:15, he says you have many teachers, 10,000 he says actually, but only one spiritual father. And then he mentions Philippians 2:19 through 22. Again, he mentioned this idea of a spiritual father. And I like the way Pastor Duane put it, is that my spiritual father doesn't replace my natural father. But I would also say this, many of us may not have been so close to our natural father. In some cases he wasn't there, in some cases that wasn't close. Like in Timothy's case, I kind of get this idea that Timothy was very, very detached, almost estranged from his natural father.
Or the natural father wasn't spiritual,
That's
wasn't
outside,
saved.
yes, it's a good point too. There was a disconnect there. It might have been there was no relationship. So a spiritual father would step in and maybe have more authority than a normal spiritual father might have because of the gap. Let me bring this to both of you guys, Pastor Gary and Pastor Jabulani. You, Pastor Jabulani, first. This idea of the following, the two things he said at the end. The first one is when he says to walk on my own. That's always been a challenge as how that fleshes out. Because for some folks, they may walk away and the connection is distant. And for some folks, they may walk away and the connection is very close. How do you see that? Yeah.
On the Zoom? Let me look at it. Okay.
Yeah, that's a great statement, Pastor Jabulani. For those of you, I know we're having some technical difficulties with the Zoom. You're not really hearing us. We're working on that, but I'm going to kind of rehearse a little bit what Pastor Jabulani is talking about. I'm going to sum up what he said so far with one word, which Pastor Duane alluded to, transition. That a lot of times this transitioning of how, it's almost in a natural realm, like when the child grows up and moves out of the house, the transition from seeing the son as a son, but rather seeing them as an adult male, as opposed to seeing them as a son. And that's a tough thing, because on the one hand, the son wants to be an adult. They want to be mature, but there's still a need in their life if the need changes. And then on the other hand, the father, the relationship evolves where he's seeing the son, but he's got to also give him some space to make mature decisions. And the way he needs you is different than the way he needed you. And the way you need him is different than the way you used to need him. Yet there still is a relationship. And there's a lot of turbulence in that transition. because a lot of times both parties don't understand the transition happening at the same time. So you may see the spiritual father trying to hold on to that relationship. He'll always see you as the little boy, or he'll always see you as the fresh Bible school student, or he'll always see you as this person. And when you try to be anything different, you're rebellious. On the other side, the son might see the father as, okay, you've always been the guy, so I can't make any decisions without talking. Or number two, you're holding me back, so I've got to escape you. I have to literally escape my spiritual father. Otherwise, I'm never going to be able to walk with God. And then you're also scared to come back and ask for help because you realize, oh, so now you need me all of a sudden. So there's no free flow. Well, you walked back through the Jordan River, so you don't need me anymore. You got the mantle, so you're good to go. So that transition is hard. And that's the reason why I feel like a lot of guys don't want to be spiritual fathers, because they think the relationship is static when it actually is organic. It grows. Pastor Gary, what would you say about that?
Yeah, I was thinking of the other side of like, well, Paul and Titus, they had it says in verse 4 of Titus chapter 1, they had a common faith where they shared in the faith together. And this is really deep. They're sharing not only in the doctrine, but they're sharing in the same spirit. They are one. And as they grew in their relationship, their spiritual relationship, there's a weaning process that happens where, you see the Father's flesh, you see the Son's flesh, but you choose the spiritual. And
good.
There's a lot of give and take where you're endeavoring to keep the unity, of this faith, of this bond, this spiritual bond. And it's the Ruth and Naomi aspect, also like Elisha and Elijah, like, your God is my God. And it's really spiritual. And even like 1 John, you don't need that a man teach you. You don't need a natural father teaching you. And a spiritual son, he doesn't want a natural father, and so the father cannot become natural or look at his son as natural. And there's no greater joy when you see that double portion on your son and you see the anointing of God in his life. And it's, where that grace came from. It's a grace where it wasn't because he's strong. It wasn't because you developed him into that. You showed him how to, go to the river and get God's grace, and you see him living in that anointing, and it's so beautiful as a father. So it never becomes natural, and there is that aspect of the son becoming an adult, and it should be beautiful for the father to see him walk in his faith. And there's incredible honor between the two, because they've got stripes on themselves because they've served God together, and they have purpose to have unity, and it's a bond of spiritual peace that's in their lives. So I mean, that's just something that I would say about that aspect.
That's beautiful. Let me throw these words up, Pastor Duane and gentlemen, to you. These words of this relationship. I'll say the words and then you can think about them a little bit. Investment, instruction, love, correction, counsel. I'm going to say access, which is an interesting word when you talk about fathers and sons. Access. And by that I mean specifically time, but access. And then this interesting word is fit. Everyone is not a good fit to be a spiritual father or to be a spiritual son. There's some people, if they were your spiritual father, you would drive a truck over them. And then there's some people that it's a good fit. the spiritual fit. So those are the words I was thinking about in the relationship, and maybe you could speak on those words. I'll start with you, Pastor Duane.
The only thing I think about those is, and I thank God for this, before the double portion came, Elijah made sure he took Elisha through the tests that were going to come. Like, I'm going here, and I want you to see what I have to go through. And Pastor Spelly did that with me on the mission field. There were times where he had to either counsel somebody or answer questions or be in different situations where he had me there so I can see the difficulties and the hard decisions and the emotional turmoil he had to go through to help somebody. And it's almost like, are you ready for this? Are you sure you want this? Because it's not all double portion. It's also double trial.
Wow. That's another word I want to add to that, preparation.
So I think those words all come in there. It's preparation for the love, and it's preparation for everything else. But letting him, I think access was a key part.
Yeah.
Letting your disciple have complete access to your life of seeing it's not all roses. It's not all glory when you preach a great message, and there's a lot of hardship and trial that comes with it too.
With that word access, you think about frailty, because Pastor Gary kind of pointed this out, that in this relationship, you bear the stripes, and the stripes that you bear sometimes have come from each other. My frailty and your frailty, you seeing all of me. I think sometimes in relationships, we're so interested in someone else's life, but we have to be willing to be transparent and be available to be transparent, and that they can see that you don't always hear from God and that you don't always make the right decision. And we bear the marks together. Like Pastor Gary kind of said, there's this honor, but there's also this frailty. And it's 1 Corinthians 2:2, I'm determined to know nothing among you save Christ and him crucified. I have to guard that relationship. As a spiritual father, I have to guard that. As a spiritual son, I have to protect that relationship as honorable, as hollow, as of God. And if I don't guard it and flesh gets in, a place gets in, that's a hard thing to fix between a spiritual son and a spiritual father. It's difficult because it's so deep, it's so personal. Because of access, that's why, really because of access.
When my father gets weak,
Yes.
I'm going to cover him. I'm going to help him.
That's an interesting statement, because some sons take advantage of when their father is weak, and it becomes the Genesis chapter 8 situation where they become Ham as opposed to Seth and Japheth. They don't walk in with the blanket, they walk in with the flashlight. And then they don't understand that in destroying their father, they destroy their legacy, they destroy their ministry.
Yes.
Pastor Gary, your thoughts on those words we used?
Yeah, those were some great words. This word like correction and instruction. I think of the word gentleness. And when someone's growing up, they need a lot of gentleness, not to scare them from being a son. And they need a lot of mercy. And when they're, you could say, venting, or when they're exposing their dislike for something, it's a time to listen and to minister to that person. It's not a time to put down, to destroy. I think of like they're when someone is kind of like venting, they're just asking a question, saying, teach me. And just thinking of David saying, your gentleness in all of his prayers, wanting his enemies destroyed. We always, him crying, we always see his soul afterwards. And nothing more beautiful than, the deep calls into the deep, and a teacher realizes, or a father in this case, realizes that he's inside of his son's soul, teaching him, and his son has given him access to teach him, to foster him, to be a and that's the transparency, and not to amplify the differences, but to be really instructive with gentleness with the son. Think of Timothy. Think of Timothy. Like, when Paul said, like, you have known the scriptures from your youth. What, Paul? You were looking at me when I was with my mom and my grandmother? You were thinking of me way back then? Like, wow. Paul's thoughts about Timothy were so deep, spiritually deep. Like, God put Timothy on his heart a long time before his mom and his grandmother ever knew it. And, Timothy was in the capacity that must have created in Timothy to see a man underneath of him like that. So I just, and we see how gentle actually and strong that Paul is with Timothy, and he's different with Timothy than he is with Titus. And he's realizing his weaknesses or his frailties or his differences, and he's so encouraging to Timothy. So
yeah, it's a great word. That kind of piggybacks a little bit off the message last night by Pastor Schaller from Matthew chapter 26. You see Jesus with the disciples. He said, "Pray, watch and pray," in verse 41. Then he says, "Pray again." He comes back to sleep. He comes back again, they're asleep. The third time he comes back to sleep, it says, "Sleep now. Just rest. It's okay. The hour has now come. Just sleep now." It's almost like he, in the midst of the greatest warfare of his life, he tells his disciples that are completely oblivious to what's happening. They have no idea what's going on. And they're just like, oh, he's going to pray like he always goes to pray. But he says something he never says any other time in the Gospels. He says, watch and pray. He makes it very specific. He's trying to tell them something supernatural is getting ready to happen, and you have no idea. But as a good spiritual father, he just says, okay, guys, I realize what I'm asking you to do, you're just not there. So rather than rebuke them, he just says, sleep now. He's gentle with them on the last night of his life. They're getting ready to kill him in a few hours. Just sleep now. It's okay. It's amazing about being gentle with a son. Because most of us guys, in the natural, you tend to be gentle with your daughters and very rough with your sons because you want to make him a man. So you got to feel like if I'm not hard on my son, the world's going to be hard on my son. So I've got to prep him for hardness. So I've got to be rough with him. And I think sometimes even in ministry, we carry that natural disposition into our relationships with men, and we disciple them in a rough way through intimidation, insults, roughness. We're rough with them. I'm toughening you up for the ministry. But then, like you said, there's a certain issue of gentleness that takes into mind capacity. Like you said, the way he was with Titus was not the way he was with Timothy. Titus, it was direct. It was this. But Timothy, he might have been the gentlest person in Timothy's life next to his mom and his grandmom. He was extremely easy with him. And he sends Timothy to 5 different locations. I mean, he could, in fact, if you study the relationship between Paul and Timothy, most of their relationship, they weren't even together. They were very rarely together, but he keeps getting sent to all these places. And Paul just writes him softly, easy. And if you're looking at the playbook on that, you're saying, Paul, you're not preparing Timothy. This is not enough for him. He needs to be hardened like a soldier, toughened up. But yet, Paul understood his capacity. And that's an interesting word, which goes back to the word access, just capacity in the intimacy of the relationship. I realize what I can say. If I've got a spiritual son and that's a button, I don't push the button. I'm going to toughen you up. No, maybe you don't. Maybe that's not God's will. Maybe that's not your role. That's not your job. Anyway, Pastor Jabulani, think of those words. I'm giving you a long time to think about them. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, Pastor Renaldo, honestly, the relationship for me has 3 important components. There's a component of there's hierarchy and equality. Hierarchy has 2 components to it. Hierarchy is about authority, leadership, and then there's the issue of submission. The one submitting, responding, the one who's being instructed, the one who is very important word that Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, which is imitation, the one who's imitating, which is indicating the fact that primarily the way that we learn is not necessarily through instruction, but actually it's through observation. I mean, that has been proven. And children, you know that children do what you do more than they do what you say.
Yes.
Because we are designed naturally. Our natural framework is that we learn pretty much almost every part of our design. We learn. We're consuming, absorbing information all the time. And unfortunately, the hierarchical aspect of relationship has meant in the natural also, value. Like the people that are in leadership, they tend to be valued more. The people who give more instruction, who have more experience, they get paid more money, they have a bigger voice. And the ones who are still learning, who are below, who are submitting, tend to be regarded as less in society. And so too, then the father-son relationship, unfortunately, suffers from that. And I think that's the reasons why so many people don't like the spiritual fatherhood thing, because they're observing the natural. The basic structure of leadership is that of a father and a son. That's the foundational framework, as far as I'm concerned, of leadership, which determines how, even in the future, we're going to respond to God, respond to our leaders out there, in the workplace, whatever. But we found that relationship has not always been the best model of what God says, because the other aspect of relationship, which Christ brings in, is equality. Christ says to us, we are his friends, we are co-heirs, we are both sons. So there's the issue of equality, which speaks about a value that does not change.
Yeah.
Which is what the cross does. The cross comes in, Christ dies for us on the cross in Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, and we are all equal before God. And the hierarchical order of relationship is not in itself, doesn't reflect the issue of who's more valuable than who.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, in the natural, we always look at that. We value office because of its usefulness. We value experience because of the contribution. And then what ends up happening is that as the transition happens, Pastor Renaldo, the father's value in a child has been the fact that they've been able to give instruction.
I gotcha.
And now that they're no longer able to give instruction, they start to wonder, what value do I then have into my son if he no longer needs my instruction the way that he does now?
Park right there. That's so good. As a father, because most of my value, I come in like, I have the information, I have the knowledge, and you don't. So let me impart to you, let me teach you. But at a certain point, and this is what Pastor Duane says, where you begin to have a walk with God, and all of a sudden, the counsel is not so instructive. It's not 8 hours of instruction. A lot of the things that I would normally tell you, you've got it. You've learned it.
Yes.
You've heard from God in it. So now I'm not teaching as much. But if your whole life as the spiritual father is a teacher, when you don't teach as much, you don't value the relationship.
Yes.
Continue.
And it is in that struggle to find your place of value in your spiritual son's life that conflict can arise.
Yeah.
Because the son, although they still understand the hierarchy, that you are the authority, you are the person that has molded them, now they're feeling undermined because you're not part of what you were giving them is equality before God. And then when you still feel that, when as a son, I view that, I'm thinking, so you don't think I'm equal before God. That's why you continue to assume that role of just overriding even some of the decisions that I'm making.
Wow.
And then in viewing you as somebody, as you telling me that I am less before God because of the hierarchical structure of our relationship, that's when some of the spiritual sons then want to run away.
Yeah, it's like you're a spiritual son. You don't want to be a son because in the value system, somehow it's viewed as less, right?
Yes,
exactly. And then you have this, I can't wait to be a father because then I'm more. I remember my daughter, she was 7, and she came to me and said, Daddy, if we have another child, can I be in charge? Because she knows if I get that position, then there's someone under me. There's power, there's authority, there's value. Because right now I'm under, and I don't want to be under much longer.
I don't want to be, no.
At 7 years old, under is long enough. I got to be over. But that's interesting. I like how you brought out the issue of value, because isn't that what it's all about? I mean, if I'm secure in the value, if the relationship evolves, if the relationship is changed, like Pastor Duane says, and Pastor Gary says, I'm happy when my son is growing up. I'm happy when they're taking steps of faith. I'm happy when they're going forward with God. And my love and our value isn't any different. What's different is in the way that I minister to you as a dad. And then as a son, it might be the way that I come to you as a son. Maybe I don't come to you with so many questions. Maybe I don't have a how do I do this? It might be, I'm doing this.
What do you think?
What do you think? And there's a good question. There was a movement in the 80s called the Shepherding Movement. And the movement taught this, basically. PTL Club kind of exposed it a little bit and knocked it all down. There's a bunch of books about it. But the shepherding movement was you couldn't make a spiritual decision as a son without first going to your spiritual father. Any major decision you had to stay under, and that hierarchy you're talking about, you needed permission. You needed a lot of permission. It wasn't like, what do you think? It was like, should I, yes or no? And the PTL Club exposed it, and they said, no, that's control, that's manipulation. That's the wrong biblical idea. That's out of direction. It's like, I like how Pastor Wayne said it. You never lose your walk with God as a spiritual son. You don't lose that. You're matured in that, but you have the liberty to hear from the Holy Spirit. And like you said, what do you think? I can ask for counsel, but this is the shocking thing about spiritual fathers. It's that in the early part of the relationship, your son asks you a lot of things, right? Every day, like, what do you think? What do you think? I have no idea. But then in the maturity of the relationship, the questions are fewer. The investigation is smaller. It's kind of like, you haven't asked me a question in a long time. You don't need my help. And it's not that I don't need your help, that maybe I don't need your instruction as deeply. Wouldn't you say, Pastor Duane?
Well, I think it's very key. That's true. And I think it's very key as a spiritual father that I support my son in any decision he makes, even if I think it's wrong.
Wow. There's the test, guys. There's the test. He's making the wrong decision. You're like, don't do it, don't do it, don't. Okay.
Hey, no problem. And when he falls in that decision, and now watch it, when he falls in that decision, I'm there to help him, support him, and pick him up.
Yeah.
And maybe he doesn't fall in that decision. Maybe I'm the one who was wrong.
That's
and
hard.
I'm willing to say that, you know what, I was wrong, but you made the right decision. I was wrong.
Wow.
That's tough.
That's extremely tough, Pastor Gary, to tell your son that you're wrong, the spiritual son, that I swung and I missed, and you were actually right about it, and I was actually wrong. How many times have you ever said you were wrong? I think men of God struggle with that. We struggle with the following phrases: I was wrong. It was my fault.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. And you were right. And shockingly, this one, I love you.
Yeah.
A lot of spiritual fathers and spiritual sons, those words are not part of our vocabulary. Here's our vocabulary. What were you doing?
What were you thinking?
What were you thinking? Were you thinking? What you should have done it this way. Those are the relationships.
You should have listened to me.
Yes.
Didn't I tell you?
Didn't I tell you?
I would have never done it like that.
I would have never done it like that. Yeah, really? So that's what you thought? Wow. That's so good, Pastor Gary. It's interesting how the cross can change your vocabulary with your spiritual son.
How the cross can change your vocabulary. Yeah. There's, at the cross, you're dead. You're trusting. You long to trust your son. Wow. You have a sense of like, I'm not as wise as I think I am. And like, who, and as a father, it's like, maybe if I want the glory of the son to, to reflect on me and, this is my identity, I want to live through my son. No, that's not it.
Correct.
I'm not going to live vicariously through my son.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not putting the demands on my son to be like, to go through the things that I went through. I want to see God take him through things. And I don't want to create a trial in his life that I think that he needs to go through.
Wow.
And there's this, sometimes we think we have to make a son. Why can't, and we think we have the tools to actually make a son. And, just like Pastor Duane said, what do you think happened when Elisha saw Elijah part the Jordan? They walked through the Jordan. It's like, it just rang in his mind. Their spiritual life, we got on the other side. We see the joy, like this is spiritual life. He knew where it came from. And then, and a son needs mercy from his father. And that's like Pastor Duane said, let him fail.
Wow.
Let him fail, because mercy, it's like Paul's like, in view of these mercies, that's why he's a minister, because he has failed and he's seen God's gentleness, God's forgiveness, God's faithfulness. And it's not about a man, it's not even about a man making a disciple, then he becomes a son. It's what about love? But like, hey, I've done everything to my son correct, except for I've never loved him. And it's like, he's not your son then. You haven't nurtured him through love. You've done everything right, except for, like you said, at the cross, you haven't loved your son. You haven't gotten God's mind once on your son. You want him to do something for you. You want, you're the Pharisee and you want him to be the feather in your cap. And you want to glory in what he's doing, overseas in Germany, and, hey, look at what Pastor Stefan's doing over there. Boy, I must be a really good, this is never our motivation, is to make a son that we can glory in.
Wow. I like how you put that God makes the son like God made the father. It's God. It's a work of God.
Yeah, it is.
And if I see it that way, I think sometimes we have this desire, we want the best for people. So sometimes we want to manufacture best for people. Because I want the best for someone, I manufacture best. Don't do that, don't do this. And that's like you said, you can't make it harder for someone because it was harder for you. So because they're not you. They might not be built the same way you're built. So they don't have to pass through everything you pass through to walk with God. I mean, Timothy had no life close to Paul's life. That was completely different. And Timothy's life was different than Titus's life. And there's also the challenge, gentlemen, of if you have more than one spiritual son, comparison. You got to be careful that you don't cookie cutter this thing and you want to raise up spiritual sons as Robotrons. And this is guys like this guy's like that. And when I make a son, notice what I said, when I make a son, hint, hint, wink, wink. When I make a son, I make him this way,
Right.
You've got to be so careful.
Beautiful.
It's a work of God. It's a work of God. Pastor Jabulani, I think a lot of what you said about that hierarchy is so true, because in the world we see these levels of authority and submission, and we can't help but import that into the church. And then when you have someone that maybe you're investing in or you're discipling him, you kind of want to, it's interesting how you want to enforce submission. You want to drop submission in there, like, it's my way because I'm in charge. And I'm over you. And we emphasize that. And like Pastor Gary said, we don't emphasize the intimacy of the relationship. We tend to intimidate with the authority of the relationship.
Beautiful.
Yeah. I'm just thinking also, Pastor Renaldo, you mentioned this part about, as a son, I wish I have a word in my mind. The word is padeo in the Greek. It's the same word that in Titus 2, verse 11, about how the grace teaches us. And in 2 Timothy 2, verse 25, also, where we have to teach in love, and it captures that hierarchy so well because it gives the illustration of a father to a parent to a son, a master to a servant, a teacher to a learner. So it captures that hierarchy extremely well, and in terms of the father teaching the son, and then that being sort of a way of contributing value or showing the value in the relationship. When they stop listening, right? When they stop listening, they then realize, oh, okay, I'm not as useful as I used to be in a child.
Yeah.
And they're not realizing that one of the ways that we feel valued in relationships is to be listened to. Now they have to learn to listen. On the other side, the child knows the value of listening, and when they're not being listened to, then they're feeling undervalued. And on the other part that you mentioned as well, there's the matter of, okay, we want to teach your child anything, and then they learn from you. But then there's this question again. If you don't allow them to make mistakes, like Pastor Duane is saying, then how do they learn the lessons that you have learned? If you don't have a plan on teaching them the lessons that they can learn through making mistakes, then how do they learn? How do they develop a framework of learning, of growing out of their mistakes and avoiding mistakes? Because as we've said, Paul mentioned it, children are more imitators. When they imitate. If primarily the way we learn is through observation, and you as a father, as a limited being who's not the all-eternal, all-knowing, ever-present God, you cannot be able to instruct and teach your children everything that they should know about every element of their lives, because there's so many parts of their lives when you're not there.
Yes.
And how then do they learn how to avoid those mistakes, how to make those right decisions in your absence if you allow them to make mistakes and learn from their mistakes? And I think that's a challenge. I think it's a challenge. It's a challenge for me as a father.
Yeah.
To take that risk, because it's a risk you're going to take. You take the risk of allowing him to make that mistake here's another thing, Mr. Renaldo, when historically I have no reference of him making decisions.
Yeah.
I cannot reflect in my thinking and see him make certain responsible decisions. Okay, Baba, I hear you're grown up, but so far you haven't proven yourself to be so grown up. So I don't know.
Yeah, it's like on the one hand, you want to give them room, but it's like you don't even see it coming. It's like the person has changed. Like you see it with natural families. When kids grow up, all of a sudden you don't have a child in the house. You've got a small adult. and they're saying things like, excuse me, did you just use that in a sentence? Or like on a spiritual level, you see a spiritual son making, oh yeah, I started a Bible study around the corner. There's 17 people. You started a what? So wait a minute. Weren't you supposed to be in my thing? No, I actually started something else. So it's this conflict of trying to figure out. And I don't think both guys get it at the same time. I think it's a process where the son, and it's also uncomfortable for the son. I kind of look at it from the other side of the conversation. The son doesn't know how to recognize what's happening in the relationship. And most of the conflict in a father-son relationship has to do with this transitional period. Because in the beginning, it's super, super clear that I have something to impart to you and I'm here to be imparted unto. Great. But then those lines start to blur. The more I'm imparted to, the relationship is evolving, and maybe neither side is even noticing it, Pastor Duane.
Yeah, it's so true. So what happens is this idea is I'm blindsided.
Yeah.
Like if I am just tunnel, like one, this is the way I do it.
Yeah. And it works.
On either side.
Yeah,
and it works.
Yeah.
That's even the worst. Yeah. It works. This is the way I do it. And so all of a sudden it's like, well, let's broaden our horizons here. Let's move into the 21st century.
What?
And it's like
social media?
But
no.
wait a minute. Yeah, what are you talking about? So same exact thing. He's like, "Oh, you're on Zoom today." I'm like, "I have no idea what you're talking about."
What is that? What is
Like,
that?
if you don't have me in studio, I ain't doing this thing.
Is that a color? Zoom what? Is that a sound effect? What is that?
Okay, I gotta broaden my horizons. Oh, look, it's right here on my phone. How do I use this?
Oh, God.
So it's the same thing in raising a spiritual son.
Yeah.
That's the way I was trained, but I also have to be open to new ways and creative ways in training my son spiritually. And I like what Pastor Jabu brought up. I believe it was Pastor Jabu, or maybe it was you. If I've got 2 or more sons,
Yeah.
one, I can't raise them all the same way.
Good luck with. Hope that works out with.
Yeah. No, I've got to be able to be open to what is one's strength versus the other one's strength, and I've got to raise them in their strength, not try to beat on their weaknesses.
Wow. Wow.
Raise them up in their strength. And so as a son, back to this point where I see the weakness of my father, I don't beat on my father about his weakness.
Wow.
I encourage him in his strength because he already knows his weakness. He's already going to have his down times, his moody times, his negative times, his depressed times. I've got to encourage him in like, man, it was so good what God did. Don't look at what went wrong. Look at what God did right. You know, and encourage him and build him up so that the same way he did with me.
Yeah. That goes back to the thing that Pastor Gary brought out about honor. In the relationship of a spiritual father and a spiritual son, as long as we protect the honor and the integrity of the relationship, we can survive the turbulence. But when you find out that the honor and the integrity and respect is not there, then it's Galatians 5:15, 16 is biting and devouring each other. And there's nothing more sad in a church when you see a spiritual father and a spiritual son at war. There's nothing more sad. It can break a church. That singular relationship can have so much damage, particularly if they are both leaders or one of them is a leader. It can severely damage a church. And it all begins because there's not honor in the relationship, because they tend to focus on the frailty of the flesh between them as opposed to the walk of faith that Pastor Gary mentioned, the walk of faith between them. And in the walk of faith, there's going to be some failure. That's why it's faith. There's a measure of failure. There's a measure of doubt. There's a measure of mistake. The humanity comes in. Because sometimes when you're the spiritual father, you assume that there's nothing wrong with me because I've got everything, and there's everything what's wrong with you, as Pastor Jabulani pointed out, in the hierarchical relationship. So you've got to fix it. So I'm always corrective with the son instead of merciful towards the son. I like how Pastor Gary also, he kind of folded it in love. In Luke 15, watch the father with the son. There's not a single word expressed from the father to the son until he comes back. Up until that point, he says nothing. And the prodigal's doing all the talking. Give me what's mine, everything. And literally when he comes back, what does he find? He finds love. He finds love. And you get the whole point of the entire story at the end. Love. Love has always been there. And I kind of sense, like from you guys' conversation, that if I have love, there's space for frailty, there's space for mercy, there's space for instruction, there's space for turbulence, but also the transition works because of love. Without love, the transition becomes organizational. I used to do this, now I don't do that. And then as Pastor Jabulani said, the value gets taken because my responsibilities have changed in your life. My ministry has changed in your life. We used to talk every day. Now we talk once a week or we talk once a month. Because we have the frequency of conversation, are you no longer my spiritual father? Am I no longer your spiritual son? Because we base it on behavior and schedule. I know all of you guys here have spiritual sons. Have you noticed over time with the men that you've discipled and you've had with spiritual sons, have you noticed that there's less time with them? You don't have as much time, or your conversations may not be so deep, so personal. They might be general a lot of times. Things you talked about before, struggles that they have, they no longer have. Are you okay with that? That's a tough challenge, you know, Pastor Gary. That's a tough challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, neither one of you guys have none of you guys have given away a daughter or a son, have you, into marriage?
Not yet.
I don't think so.
Stop scaring
Not
me.
yet.
I don't want to.
Stop scaring me.
Okay.
Thank you.
So that's exactly what, you could say what we're talking about. It's a huge transition for the parent, for the father. And the two are becoming one. Your child is getting married, and you really have to go back to the foundation, like I said, of love, you have to realize that God is taking something out of your life, and the future is going to be better. And there's God wills in us both to will and to do his good pleasure. And there's that pause there where you're just trusting God that something good is going to happen out of this. And this is, with this son, giving him this responsibility. I mean, what was the foundation based upon anyway? Wasn't it based upon love? And so as a father, I've got to go back to that. I'm gonna love my son. And then you're gonna see the goodness that happens in your son's life when you go through that process. And then Pastor Jabulani was talking about the instruction. Isn't that what Proverbs is all about? Is Solomon is saying, almost like, I wish I would have loved my father's instruction more. Like, don't forget your father's instruction and the reproof and the correction. Don't forget it. Like, go back to it. The father's instruction it can be so sweet, son. Don't forget that either. So, beautiful. I mean, guys, we've all worked with Pastor Belly. Have you ever, sometimes just been amazed at a one-liner or just his incredible wisdom or his love that is so deep? It's just, it blows my mind away to see a father that, and here we are, these little technons, and he's got this father's love, and he wants us to be a hoyos, an adopted son. And we're like, oh, I didn't realize that. And it's so great when God reveals to you your father's heart.
That's beautiful. Closing thoughts, Pastor Duane.
Just go back to this one thing about, what Pastor Gary just said. It's going to cost me something.
Yeah.
Elisha says to Elijah, give me a double portion. Because you love me, because I love you, ask of me anything and I'll give it to you. Okay, give me a double portion. You know what that means? Give me your portion and my portion.
Wow.
So Elisha literally had to give up, willingly
Beautiful.
give up his portion to Elisha.
Beautiful.
Say, you know what? If you see me go, you got it.
Wow.
Because I love you,
Beautiful.
I'll give you my portion. I don't need it. I don't want it. I want you to have it.
That's awesome.
Beautiful.
That's spiritual sonship and fathership.
Wow. He just reminded me of a Shabelli story. We'll close with this. One of the many. I'm in a meeting with Pastor Belias and two other pastors in Zambia, and we are arguing for 45 minutes trying to figure something out. He walks by and overhears what's being said. He just says 2 sentences, and we got quiet for 20 minutes, and we realized, that's it. That's it.
Yeah.
So Lisa just said, that's it. And I said, my God, 2 sentences. And then he keeps going.
Yeah.
It was like he threw his mantle and kept walking, and we're like, what? That's it.
Yeah.
And Pastor Belias says, that's it. I said, yeah, it's 2 sentences, and we're done. And then you realize it all comes flooding back to you. I remember there's another situation. I got time for one more. We were in Ghana. I'm with Pastor Alfred Zeke, where we were trying to solve a situation, and we kind of screwed it up badly. And we just destroyed it. We made it worse. We inflamed it. And then he walked up to us. Evidently, he caught wind of it. He said, am I your spiritual father? We both said, yes. He said, okay, because I need to tell you something, but I need to confirm it before I say that. I said, okay. And he said, he pretty much explained how we destroyed the whole thing. And just, and the first side of me, I wanted to get upset and no, we no. And then it just kind of washed over me like, okay, all right. And then he quietly walked away and fixed it in 24 hours. But we just totally destroyed it. It was it's horrible. But it was interesting how he prefaced it. It's amazing how that kind of comes in. So it's been a great, great conversation, gentlemen. Thank you so much. for being on the program. Pastor Jabulani Zwane, Pastor Gary Groenewold, Pastor Duane George, myself. Awesome topic. Great program. Wish we had more time. We could go another hour. It's so many sides to this.
Good to see you guys.
Thank you. God bless
Great
you.
to see you guys.
See you next week on Missions Monday. God bless you.
All right.